Greetings, this is the Question GM. So this is RPGADay 2020 day number 6. And the word of the day is forest. So forest is a geographical type of location. It's one of the many staples of locations that can be found in a fantasy role-playing game such as D&D. I guess in my experience when it comes to running forest, and as someone who lives in a tropical country, who has never set foot inside a temperate forest before of any in any of the Western Northern Hemisphere world, it was probably a little bit difficult to get into the mindset of a forest, of traversing into a forest. So the common practice that I tend to do was a forest was just another location in the adventure for the characters to traverse through. There is not much difference between encounters that happen in the forest and an encounter that happens in the open plain or in the mountains or in a volcano for those similar reasons. And this is definitely not been encouraged, from more recent modules of, for example, from the D&D line, at least the more modern ones, because there is this lack of provision of the imagination, because of how they are written at times. The forest in the fantasy world, in the fantasy role-playing game, seems to have lost some of its edge. This got me thinking, what is it exactly what is the implications of going into a forest? And I can only base what I'm about to say on my own expectations, my own imaginations, and also from just the literature that's found around forests, the myths and and maybe some of the histories that when it comes to talking about forests in a fantasy context. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about some themes, some tropes, and some things to consider when you decided when a party or your characters have decided they are going to enter into a forest, and what are the potentials that could come up. So the first thing we should know, and this is, I think, this is a universal theme across all wooded areas, and especially for myself in a tropical country, it's obviously involving like a jungle, can be a forest, whatever names they are being called in whatever geographical region that you're found. But the main difference between a forest and a flatland or a plain is, there's trees. There are many types of growth that's happening in a forest compared to what's on the flatland, which is probably there is a consistent undergrowth that grows around it. But in the forest, there's the variance and the diversity, extrapolates a lot more. The most typical thing that you will find in a forest are obviously the trees. Trees and plant growth of various heights, various thickness, presents a different kind of problem that you wouldn't normally find in a flatland, which is obviously visibility. The idea that you're entering into a place where you cannot really actually see where you're going is probably one of the primal fears of entering into the forest, especially if you're entering from a place where visibility is relatively open. The idea that you're entering into a space where not only you can't see where you're going, but there are plenty of things that can be happening around you without you noticing it, is probably one of the first concerns of entering into a forest, that your visibility will be affected in ways that will probably overstimulate you, or it would hinder your typical sense of sight or vision. And that's not even counting into areas like smell or sounds, because especially in the tropical countries, sound, at the moment you enter into a jungle, sound is actually one of the first few things that really catches your attention from the either the bustle of cities or the stillness and quietness of flatland. Suddenly there's a buzzing, there's a real high pitched buzzing that surrounds you the moment you enter into a forest. So visibility and a unusual stimulation to your senses is probably some of the scary things that of entering into a forest that you should think about. Sometimes it's not even the natural growth that would stifle your visibility. There can be other natural occurrences that can happen in the forest, such as like weather, which causes fog. So there can be numerous trees, and to make it worse, there is fog around the area. And even light can actually be an issue, because with the growth of trees and their spanning branches. What would have normally been bright sunlight on the open plains may have been blocked and covered by the trees when you enter into a forest. That can obviously vary depending on how thick the forest is. If it's a much more virgin, untouched forest, the trees may be tall enough or diverse enough to actually block all sunlight, making it effectively almost as dark as night, even when there's like bright sunlight outside the forest. And with visibility comes a second concern. With the lack of visibility comes a second concern, which is there is an element of something that could be hidden in the forest. And this makes it the perfect place for ambushes, especially if someone who is very familiar with the terrain, familiar with the lifestyle of the forest, familiar with the lay of the land, and familiar with where are the good hiding spots in the forest, especially if you are in some sort of adventure where it involves maybe tracking somebody into a forest. Then that becomes the challenge of finding something that is essentially going to be hidden, where something that has plenty of places to hide, and it will take a lot more skills and a lot more danger to uncover what can be hidden. But in the same way, this can work in the reverse, in the sense that the ability of the forest to hide something could mean that it could provide protection, whether for the people who are entering the forest or whether for people who are living in the forest. You could reverse in a similar situation where if the players are a party who are running away from something, maybe from the local authorities for doing something they did in the cities, the first places they would go to lose their tracks is obviously into a forest, which can be a double-edged sword, in the sense that not only are they protecting themselves from the outside world, but they are also endangering themselves into the dangers that can be found in the forest. Other than this element of visibility and hiddenness of the forest, one thing that is a concern about travel through the forest or within the forest is the sign that it's typically a wild place, and unless the forest has been is a well-traveled forest, and there maybe have been trails or roads that have been made or trail blazed ahead, there is an element of getting lost in a forest, especially one that is more untamed. So not only is the concern of immediate presence, of immediate perception of what's happening around you, there is a more longer concern of, will I be able to find my way out of this forest if I need to, or maybe that is the intent, is to find my way out, and how do I find my way out without the usual or typical means of doing so. Another challenge that comes with the visibility problem is tracking. Like I said, if they coming back to the simple example of if the PCs are sent to track somebody who's hiding in the forest, there are different ways to track someone in the forest as compared to tracking someone in cities or in more open terrain. With all these several factors all stacking up each other, that is the first dangers, first fears when it comes into entering what it means to enter into forest. And it all stems from the very beginning of the idea that there is a lack of visibility, and that sort of has a domino effect on different various concerns that you would have as a result of a lack of visibility. The next thing that I want to talk about entering into a forest, and why, and this is something maybe more related to literature and mythology, is the idea that forests are mysterious by nature. And maybe this is the way they were portrayed, or at least in more of the mythological traditions of the Western world. A forest always exudes a sense of mystery, a sense of the supernatural in some sense. And maybe that has something to do with the age of a forest as compared to other lands, because seeing trees growing up to such great heights, seeing that it has not been touched by civilization, implies that there is a certain amount of years that has gone in. There is a certain amount of growth, there's a certain amount of evolution that has happened within those within the confines of a wooded space, that implies that it has survived much longer than other lands, and especially more urban lands that has been only developed sometimes only in more recent human memory, or maybe even to the extent of other lifelong races. For a forest to remain as a forest means that it started from a natural state and it has survived for that long in that natural state. And because of for that reason, I think in some literature, the forest gives the impression, because of its age, because of its maintenance of the ancient order, the old ways, there could be some sense of the supernatural that still resides within the forest. Maybe civilization is developed through more modern ways of thinking, but maybe those modern ways of thinking do not explain what can be found inside the forest, and maybe there are still things that reside in the forest that defies the more modern kinds of thinking or ideologies or maybe religion or technologies that are found outside the forest. And in the Western tradition, I believe that association of the supernatural to forests comes in several flavors. But I think it's quite for the sake of brevity for this video, I think it's quite easy to just boil it down to benevolent and evil forces. And because of when a forest has and it really depends on your setting. Like if it's a setting that comes from an age of darkness, an age of chaos, and it was and order was later on brought into the world, then all those ancient chaos may still be residing in the forest. But at the same time, maybe if the world has already withered and died, and chaos has become the prevalent zeitgeist of the era, maybe there's still forces of good that still reside in the forest. But I guess one way how a fantasy world portrays supernatural forces, both benevolent and evil, in a forest, it crops up in why there are depictions of the fairies, trickster creatures that live by their own rules and typically of the forest. And sometimes, and if you read about some mythologies regarding fairies and fae, they always give the impression to a more civilized race that they are tricksters, and only because the fae come with a very different mindset of how they live, of how they should live, what are their values when it comes to living in the forest, and because of they see people who enter into the forest are entering into their domain, and therefore they should be exploited for the gain of the fairy folk who live in the forest, whether even at the expense of those who would find their ways and their means and their tricks and their pranks harmful to them, but to the benefit of those who live in the forest. And that's not necessary to say that a fae are inherently evil. It's just that they have a very mysterious and alien way of thinking that may sound similar or may have some similarities with civilized folk, but at the end of the day, a civilized folk is still cautioned and still warned that what the fae wants in the forest may not necessarily be beneficial to the people who step into their domains. And then the idea of the age and posterity of a forest means that also gives a feeling of sacredness. As I talked about, for a forest to remain as a forest for this long, probably also instills an idea that there should be an amount of respect that should be paid to a forest. And this is definitely a very prevalent theme, especially if you're playing in a fantasy role-playing game that involves a circle of druids or a organization of rangers who bestow upon themselves the duty of guarding the forest, to defend it from encroachments, whether by civilization or by evil forces, or by forces who will try to develop or exploit the resources of the forest. And that can depend on for different reasons. Like, is it to protect something that was natural, or is it to protect an old order of things? And so if a character enters into the forest, what is their relationship that they have towards the sacredness of the old ways, is probably something that will prop up uh, and make a more interesting interaction between characters who live in the forest and the characters who just travel along their way. And I think the third thing that a third theme of entering into a forest, and this is probably where some mechanics can really come into play. And this is, and in my experience, not something very fully explored in more modern editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and maybe some other non-travel based role-playing games, is the idea of resources, or the lack of or the lack of thereof. Uh, and it's not to say that forest by nature is lack of resources, but it's the spotting of the resources that are available, and the access to those resources that is challenging for those who are not familiar with the ways of the forest, and therefore it requires a very specialized skill set, not only to traverse through, but also to survive in a forest. And that can be a theme. That can easily be a theme that that can be replicated in mechanical terms, in the sense that if you are traveling through a forest, and I think Dungeons and Dragons does this even to some extent. If you're traveling through a forest, the speed of your movement is typically slowed down, unless you have someone who is able to guide you, and maybe there's also the ability to cover your tracks while you're traversing through the forest, which therefore leads into reduced speed and lengthens the time of travel. Food becomes an issue. Water also becomes an issue. Like, where do you find your sources of food, and where do you find your sources of water? And you could typically, the most typical answer would be to say, if the forest is plentiful, then foraging shouldn't be an issue. But then foraging does bring up different concerns, like, are you foraging edible plants, or will you mistakenly forage something that has natural resistance against those who would consume it? and non-edible plants, poisons, toxins of creatures. Hunting also becomes an issue. Can be an issue in the forest as compared to non forested areas. Finding game, looking for their tracks, following their tracks. Do you practice ethical hunting? In the sense of, do you only kill adults and you spare the young, or do you only kill the young and spare the adults because they have a chance of procreation? These are questions that can come in when you are traveling when you're hunting in the forest, and all this is just predicated on the assumption that you have someone who is capable of having these skills to perform the things that you need to survive in the forest. What happens if that anchor is lost? There's nobody in the party has those skills, or maybe the guide that you had is already killed. What happens then? How do you set up camp in the forest? Do you have the right do you have the right resources, like fuel? Do you have the right resources, like shelter? Do you have the right resources, or do you have the right amount of time that it takes to set up camp? And the considerations of, if you're setting up camp but you're also a fugitive, how do you set up a cold camp, and what are the consequences of setting up a cold camp compared to having a warm fire around you, especially during a much colder climate? So these are just some ideas I'm throwing out, some themes, some tropes, and definitely maybe some mechanical considerations that you will have to think about. And I don't expect many rules, many fantasy RPGs nowadays to have a very concrete system about this. Maybe a few good examples would be the One Ring RPG, but I've never read through the pages. But from what I was told, the traveling rules are quite robust. But even if the system doesn't support it, I think there is something for you to take away here in consideration of what it means to be in a forest in a fantasy role-playing game. So this is day 6 of RPGADay 2020, with the word of the day being the forest, and I hope you have happy foresting in your next game. So this is the Questing GM signing out for now, and I'll see you on day 7.